they victims or are they deserving of their fate? Across 3 continents, juvenile facilities have sparked outrage and divided public opinion. At California's Barry J. Nidorf Juvenile Hall, teenagers fell through the cracks, overdosing behind bars meant to rehabilitate them. In Australia's Dondale Youth Detention Centre, even 10-year-olds faced tear gas, restraints, and solitary confinement. And in India's Muzaffarpur shelter home, young girls were subjected to unthinkable horrors, exploited by the very system meant to protect them. But here's the question that haunts us. Were these institutions too harsh, or did society fail by being too lenient on troubled youth? Is juvenile crime an excuse for cruelty, or a call for compassion? Tonight, we expose the harrowing truths of these prisons and challenge you to decide what happens when a facility designed to rehabilitate young offenders becomes a place of punishment, fear, and neglect. Welcome to Barry J. Nidorf Juvenile Hall in California, a name that has become a symbol of systemic failure in juvenile justice in early 2023. Tragedy struck when Elijah, a 16-year-old detainee, died of an overdose inside the facility. Drugs had circulated freely within its walls, a symptom of the chronic lack of oversight. For years, Barry J. Nidorf had been plagued by allegations of abuse. Minors locked in cells for up to 22 hours a day, staff using excessive force, and little to no mental health support for vulnerable youth. This incident spurred outrage and renewed calls for reform.
This month, Rob Bonta slammed the conditions at the facilities as appalling and filed court papers seeking to force the county to immediately remedy illegal and unsafe conditions.
By mid-2023, officials announced the closure of the facility, acknowledging its failure to protect the children entrusted to its care. But for many former detainees like Elijah, the damage was already done. How did we let it reach this breaking point? Barry J. Nidorf Juvenile Hall, located in Sylmar, California, was once envisioned as a temporary detention center where juveniles awaiting trial or sentencing could receive rehabilitation. But over the years, this facility, part of the Los Angeles County Juvenile Hall system, has come to represent the very worst of the system: overcrowding, systemic neglect, and repeated incidents of abuse. An investigation revealed that the drugs circulating inside the facility were largely unregulated, with minimal efforts by staff to intervene. This incident was not an isolated one. Reports from former detainees highlighted that drugs had become a recurring issue within the hall, and there was a culture of indifference by both staff and administration. Elijah's death was the breaking point that brought attention to the many other systemic issues that had been overlooked for years. Former inmates of Barry J. Nidorf described an environment far removed from the rehabilitative purpose the institution was supposed to serve. One survivor, David, recounted how he was often confined to his cell for up to 22 hours a day, leaving little time for education or mental health care. "The system doesn't care about us," he shared in an interview years later, reflecting on his time there. But for the many young lives impacted by the abuses, the closure came too late. "Closing it down is not enough," said a former inmate. "You can shut the doors. But what happens to the kids who've been through it? What happens to the system that allowed it to happen in the first place?" The closure of Barry J. Nidorf Juvenile Hall may be seen as a step toward addressing the failures in juvenile justice, but it raises crucial questions about the future of youth detention in California. Dondale Youth Detention Centre, Australia. Can you imagine a 14-year-old boy, hooded, strapped to a chair and screaming for his mother while guards watch with indifference? This was not a scene from a dystopian film. It was the horrifying reality at Dondale Youth Detention Centre, Australia's most notorious juvenile facility. In 2016, Dondale Youth Detention Centre in the Northern Territory became infamous when a leaked footage of Dylan Voller, a 14-year-old Indigenous boy, being strapped to a restraint chair and hooded was aired on Australia's Four Corners program. The shocking video showed Voller, visibly distressed, helplessly crying for his mother as prison guards stood by without intervening. This haunting image would become a symbol of the abuse suffered by young detainees at the facility. Don Dale's violent and dehumanizing treatment of youth, especially Indigenous children, became the subject of intense national and international scrutiny.
Children. But in truth, given that the vast majority of those at the Northern Territory and prisons are Aboriginal, this is also a report into the abuse of Indigenous Australians. That makes its findings particularly sensitive. Australia has a dark history of abuse towards the so-called First Australian.
The footage revealed not only the physical restraints used against Voller, but also the routine use of tear gas against minors, solitary confinement, and excessive physical force used by staff to control detainees. In a tragic turn, one detainee reported being stripped naked and left alone in a cold, dark cell for days, a form of isolation that is often used as punishment rather than for safety. Was he not just a kid? This question could prompt myriads of responses. Voller had already spent years in and out of juvenile detention facilities, beginning as young as 11. In his case, the system's response to his behavior was punitive rather than rehabilitative.
I was going to die, my heart was racing because of that tear gas. My eyes were burning, couldn't hardly see properly.
He was regularly subjected to solitary confinement, often for days at a time. His case, like those of many other children in Don Dale, reflected the systemic issues in Australia's juvenile detention system, where Indigenous youth are overrepresented. The exposure of these conditions led to widespread public outcry, with many questioning how a government-run detention facility could treat children with such cruelty. The Royal Commission into the Protection and Detention of Children in the Northern Territory.
Good evening, Karina Carvalho with ABC News. The Northern Territory teenager at the centre of a Four Corners expose of the youth detention system has given harrowing details of his alleged mistreatment. 19-year-old Dylan Voller told a Royal Commission he was sometimes deprived of food and water and even access to a toilet. 5 hours.
I ended up having to defecate into a pillowcase because they wouldn't let me out to go to the toilet. And then eventually when I got let out the next morning, I was able to chuck that pillowcase out.
Commission's investigation shockingly exposed that the guards at Don Dale frequently employed violent tactics to control young detainees, including hitting them with shields, using pepper spray and forcibly restraining them, sometimes for hours. But the abuse wasn't limited to physical violence. Many of the detainees suffered from mental health issues that were left unaddressed. Mental health professionals were notably absent, leaving many children to endure trauma with no support. The Royal Commission, 2016 to 2017, actually revealed that Indigenous children make up around 60% of the juvenile detainees in the Northern Territory, despite comprising just 30% of the overall population. This racial disparity led to accusations of systemic racism and neglect. As the Royal Commission's report unfolded, the country was forced to confront the brutality of its juvenile justice system.
A guard admitted that in front of us. Mind you, he couldn't deny it because it was on. We had the footage.
Which one of you boys wants something? Come something.
What about acting in the best interest of the child? The UN
Recommendations for reform included raising the age of criminal responsibility from 10 to 14, implementing a ban on the use of solitary confinement for young people, and ensuring that Indigenous children received culturally appropriate care and rehabilitation.
That the money, instead of being put into a new centre, should be put into a community-based program where they should start up a work camp and
However,
stuff like that.
Years after the Royal Commission's findings, the question remains: have these recommendations been fully implemented, and what has changed for the children still detained? Muzaffarpur Shelter Home, India. In 2018, over 30 girls came forward with horrendous accounts of sexual abuse, torture, and neglect. A government-run shelter for vulnerable girls turned into a house of horrors. In India's Muzaffarpur Shelter Home, the very people meant to protect children preyed on them. The shelter's operator, Brajesh Thakur, used his political influence to evade scrutiny for years. Survivors described being drugged, locked in dark rooms, and assaulted repeatedly. One girl secretly revealed the terror of watching her peers vanish, with suspicions of burials on the property. The Muzaffarpur shelter home scandal in Bihar, India, is one of the most shocking cases of abuse in recent history. This case exposed widespread neglect, sexual abuse, and exploitation of vulnerable girls, most of whom were minors, in an institution that was supposed to protect them. The role of Brajesh Thakur. Brajesh Thakur, the operator of the shelter, was not just a corrupt individual, but someone with extensive political connections. He ran the shelter in a highly exploitative manner, using it as a way to profit from government funds meant for the care of vulnerable children. Thakur reportedly turned a blind eye to the abuse, and in some cases was directly involved in the exploitation of the girls. The girls in the shelter, many of whom were orphans, abused, or abandoned, were subjected to horrific conditions, including being drugged, isolated, and assaulted. Key events leading to the scandal: the initial whistleblower report, 2018. In April 2018, a social worker named Rita approached the police with a report detailing the abuse occurring at the Muzaffarpur shelter home. She had gathered testimony from girls who had either been recently removed or had managed to escape. Rita's report was the catalyst for the police investigation that eventually led to the discovery of the horrors inside the shelter. The investigation and discovery. May 2018. The case took a dramatic turn when the police found evidence that confirmed the abuse allegations. The investigation revealed that over 30 girls had been sexually assaulted by men who were brought in under Thakur's supervision. In some cases, the abuse was so severe that forced abortions were performed on the victims, further indicating the scale of the exploitation. The police also discovered that some girls had been kept in isolation for long periods, were subjected to physical punishment, and were deprived of food and basic necessities. The shelter, which was meant to be a safe haven for young girls, had become a site of systematic sexual exploitation. The girls were given no access to proper health care, education, or mental health support, and many were subjected to severe emotional and physical trauma. The scandal caused extensive media exposure and public outcry. As the news broke in the media in May 2018, with reports in major newspapers like the Indian Express, BBC, and the Times of India took it up, detailing the horrific conditions inside the shelter. The public outcry was immediate and intense. The abuse at Muzaffarpur led to protests across India, with citizens demanding justice for the victims and calling for better oversight of India's child welfare systems. The arrests and legal proceedings. After the scandal was exposed, Brajesh Thakur and several others involved in the abuse were arrested. The charges included sexual assault, trafficking, forced abortions, and corruption. Thakur was a well-known figure, and his political connections helped him maintain power for years, despite the abuse going largely unreported. His arrest was a significant moment in the case, as it demonstrated that even powerful individuals were not above the law. In 2020, Thakur was sentenced to life imprisonment for his role in the abuse, but for many, this was just the beginning of a long road to justice. So viewers, do subscribe to CrimeLore. Till the next one, stay safe and stay curious.